let me start this talk, this second lecture of the lecture series with A.H. Almaas Hamid. The topic of today is Krishnamurti, part 1, his teachings, and Hamid will talk about or try to illuminate Krishnamurti's contribution to the modern spiritual practice, and he will explore the role of observation without conceptual overlay. Hamid writes under the pen name A.H. Almaas, and he was born in Kuwait in 1944. At the age of 18, he moved to the US to study at the University of California in Berkeley. Hamid was working on his PhD in physics when he reached a turning point in his life and destiny that led him to inquire to the psychological and spiritual aspects of human nature rather than the physical nature of the universe. He left the academic world to pursue an in-depth journey of inner discovery, applying his scientific precision and discipline to personal and experiential research. This included study with different teachers and different modalities, extensive reading, and continuous study of his own consciousness in an effort to understand the essential nature of human experience and reality in general. Hamid's process of exploration led to the creation of the Ridhwan School, and with Karen Johnson resulted in the founding of the unfoldment of the Diamond Approach. There are a lot of students from the Diamond Approach also here in this call. He's the author of over 19 different books, and he will guide the lecture today on Krishnamurti. Welcome, Hamid. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Daniela. Good to be with you all. We're going to be discussing Krishnamurti. There are 2 lectures, this one, another one a few weeks later. Krishnamurti was one of the iconic figures, spiritual iconic figures in the 20th century. He taught for most of the 20th century because he was there from the beginning of that century, and he didn't die till 1986, I think. So he lived to old age, 91, and he taught almost till the end. He gave talks. I don't know that he'll say he taught. His story is interesting, and he's an interesting figure because his teaching sounds simple, although a little bit enigmatic, but he is a very complex character. And for me to really do the thing right, with due diligence, I divided it into 2 talks, 2 lectures. So he was first educated and trained by what's called the Theosophists, the Theosophy Society at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. They found him when he was a teenager. Their main leader, one of their main leader, Dr. Leadbeater, who had written books on, chakras and Kundalini and things like that, found him, and he thought he was the right person they were looking for. They were looking for somebody they thought would be a good vehicle for what they consider the most important force or teacher to come into this world. So they were looking for a vehicle for this other teacher, who they called Lord Maitreya. Lord Maitreya comes from Buddhism. Maitreya is supposedly in Buddhism the next Buddha. Gautama Buddha was the Buddha 2,500 years ago, and supposedly the next Buddha, according to Buddhism, which is in another 2,500 years, Maitreya will be the next Buddha. Anyway, the Theosophists thought of Maitreya as somebody who could come through. They believed he came through Jesus. He came through many other than Krishna, and they're going to find. They're working to find a vehicle fit for the Lord Maitreya to come through him. So when they found Krishnamurti, which I'm going to call K most of the time for short, because many people call him K or Krishnaji. And he thought he'd be a fit vehicle because he looked sort of empty and empty-minded. And he thought he didn't have much ego. So they took him in, they talked to his parent, they took him in, and his brother Nitya. And they started educating him and training him, he and his brother, for many years. And they were preparing him to be what's called the world teacher. So for them, that was their big project. The Theosophy Society was what's called a cultist society, in the sense they believed in telepathy, clairvoyance, and they have their master Kuthumi, supposedly lives in the Himalayas, come to them psychically, either to speak to them or come in the room from a distance. And also Lord Maitreya supposedly is the one who they're all preparing for. At that time, Annie Besant, Mrs. Annie Besant, was the leader of the society, and she took Krishnamurti under her wings. She loved him, took care of him. She made sure he had all the care, all the support. She took him to London, to him and his brother, to be educated and learn English well, and he learned to dress in a Western way, and that's why you see him most of the time in a suit and a tie, things like that. So he actually, at some point, in his training, at some point, he got some very important transformative experiences while he was still with the Theosophist. He had an important experience in Ojai, California, which is one of the places they found for him. And after that, a few years later, he abandoned the position. He was going along with the idea that he's going to be the vehicle for the New World teacher. But at some point, at age late in his late 20s, he abandoned the whole idea. He went against it, and he abandoned the Order of the Star. They had established an organization called the Order of the Star to support the world teachers. He abandoned it. He said he doesn't want anything to do with it. He said he's not the world teacher they were expecting. He basically, abandoned the whole thing. He went against the Theosophist idea. And he said something that was shocked them all. And I'll read you a quote here from something he said at the beginning of his disconnection or disavowal of that point of view. He said here, that's a talk he gave at some point, I think, someplace in India. I maintain that truth is a pathless land, and you cannot approach it by any path whatsoever, by any religion, by any sect. That is my point of view, and I adhere to that absolutely and unconditionally. Truth, by being limitless, unconditioned, and unapproachable by any path whatsoever, cannot be organized, nor should any organization be formed to lead or coerce people along a particular path. I took the quote from The Years of Awakening by Mary Lutyens, which is a biography of him by somebody who knew him personally and daughter of one of his closest friends. Actually, this point of view that no teaching, no practice can lead to the truth, he made it a center to his teaching But it is not new. Many teaching had that, but they had it as part of the teaching, as one stage of the teaching. He took it as the central thing and the main thing about his teaching. It wasn't a stage, it was the teaching. An interesting thing is that Krishnamurti taught throughout the 20th century, but there were other teachers in the West. He taught in the West, which is how he became very well known in the Western audiences. He taught in Europe, and United States, and India mostly. He traveled around. I think he might have even went to Australia, and he spent most of his life traveling around and giving talks about his perspective, about his understanding of human nature, understanding of reality, which he didn't call a teaching. But he was teaching at a time in the West where the other teachers in the West were also bringing teaching to the West, like Gurdjieff was at that time. Gurdjieff was teaching in New York at that time. Idris Shah, Naqshbandi Sufi, he was teaching, giving, his center was in London, where Krishnamurti will go there frequently. In the beginning of the 20th century, there was Vivekananda, who brought in the Advaita Vedanta perspective to the United States. There was also Paramahansa Yogananda from India. And there's Anayat Khan, who brought in the whole, it's called the Sufi movement, that has many followers now. All those people taught to a specific group, although some of them spoke to the masses. Krishnamurti taught mostly in large group, thousands, tens of thousands of people. Because really, when he started, although he disavowed the view of Theosophy, he was still an important figure in the Theosophy Society. He was sort of one of the leaders, or the main leader. And also, he had the whole support of that whole society. There were hundreds of thousands of people there already, and they were all following him, going to his talks. So he already had a big base of support and listeners and audience. And that, from there, it developed further. So wherever he went to talk, many people came to listen to him. He didn't really give practices. He didn't, because he thought there was no way to, no method, no teaching that could take you to the truth. And also he engaged in dialogue at some point in his life with different important personalities at the time, for scientists sometimes, like David Bohm, the physicist. He could be actually a pioneer. He could be seen as a pioneer in bringing the idea of direct spiritual experience and insight into the West, although those other teachers I talked about were also doing it. But all those people were part of a lineage that he didn't have a lineage, although he came from Theosophy. I mean, his relationship to authority, lineages, tradition is a big question, controversial thing, and I will give more time to it in the second lecture, not in this lecture. Because Krishnamurti's situation is complex, much more complex than Nisargadatta, for instance, which was my first lecture a month ago, I'm giving it 2 talks. And this first one, I will be talking mostly about his teaching and some of the experiences from which his teaching comes, and that his teaching can lead to, and that he experiences related to his main emphasis. In the second teaching, I will be dealing with a question, dealing with other kind of experience he's had that I'm not emphasizing in this teaching, in this talk today, which is his main, actually, kind of experience, which he didn't bring to his teaching, didn't mention his teaching. In fact, many of his experiences he doesn't bring to his teaching, doesn't mention, and doesn't bring to his talks. And I also will deal with the question of what is called the process, his headaches, the pain he went through for most of his life was most intense around the time his initial transformation started then, but continued throughout his life. I'll bring it, and because there was no understanding of it, and I think I have some understanding of it because I've had some similar experience. And I will deal with the question of idea of no path, no tradition, and an issue with authority, and what's that about? And how truly he really adhered to it, and how true it is in his case, because he stressed it and he kept talking about it. His main teaching, most of his teaching, when he's talking about fear, freedom from fear, freedom from conditioning, the conditioned self, freedom from time, from the past, from thought, that's not new. Most spiritual teaching do that. He might have thought he was introducing new teaching there. That wasn't actually new. I mean, most of the other teachers I mentioned were teaching something similar. And most spiritual teaching in the East teach about those things, and even in the West. However, his emphasis is different. His emphasis is about that it's a pathless path, that there's no way, no practice, no teachers. That's his emphasis, and that's what distinguishes him. And he has his way also of approaching experience, that he didn't call it a practice, but he has a way of approaching it that I will discuss, and I will read some quotes. As I said, he didn't bring many of his experiences and his teaching. You don't find them in most of his books. You find them in some few biographical places. Like some of them are in the biographies that Mary Lutyens wrote. She had 3 books, actually. The Years of Awakening, The Years of Fulfillment, and the last one, The Open Door, for the last 10 years of his life. But most of his experiences, you really want to know, you have to read Krishnamurti's notebook, which is something he wrote himself in the 60s, and spanned about 2-3 years of his life. And he was writing every day what happens to him, what is his kind of experience. That gives you a good window into his universe. His main suggestion when in his talks, the main thing he talks about is observation, to observe oneself. You can say it is really a practice. He didn't call it a practice, but that's what he talked about, to observe. He said intensely, you have to observe with discipline, with intensity, with passion. You really want to know, and you have to be focused this way. And that is what he did, I think. And he was trying to communicate to his audience that what can happen. Basically, it's a witness and observation of mind without trying to do anything to it. Just simply observe it. Don't change it. Don't try to change it. Don't have any idea of what to do with it. And also to look at it to observe without the influence of the mind, without the influence of your past experience, without the influence of memory. And he thought if we do that, if one is engaged in such way of approaching their experience, there's a big change can happen, a big transformation, that he called it a mutation. When one then is free and liberated and has full access to the sacred. This intense observation he talked about is to understand the various phenomena that arise in experience, to understand life, reality, but to understand things like fear, hope, desire, time, thinking. For instance, with fear is to understand fear and what is its cause without using your knowledge, without using your association, without using what you've heard and learned about fear, just to be with it completely and intensely. So the idea is not to use one's knowing ordinary mind, but to intensely pay attention in a focused and distracted way, so the mind's ideas are not in the way of experiencing and understanding the fear. The result, he says, is a freedom from fear and peacefulness. I'll give you a quote here. When there is constant observation, there's no movement of past. To observe implies seeing very clearly. To see very clearly, there must be freedom. Freedom from resentment, freedom from enmity, freedom from any prejudice or grudge, freedom from all those memories that one has stored up as knowledge, which interfere with seeing. When there is that quality, that kind of freedom with constant observation, not only the things outside, but also inwardly, what is actually going on, what then is the need of seeking at all? For it is all there, the fact, the what is, it is observed. But the moment we want to change what is into something else, the process of distortion takes place. Observing freely without any distortion, without any evaluation, without any desire for pleasure, and just observing, we see what is undergoes an extraordinary change. This is from The Flight of the Eagle. So far, many of us will think, well, this sounds like mindfulness. Mindfulness is basically being aware of what is happening. And it sort of sounds like that, but as we read more quotation, you will see it's not exactly mindfulness. I'll read you the next quote. Attention is not the same as concentration. Concentration is exclusion. Attention, which is total awareness, excludes nothing. If you want to understand the beauty of a bird, a fly, or a leaf, or a person with all his complexities, you have to give your whole attention, which is awareness. And you can give your whole attention only when you care, which means you really love to understand. Then you give your whole heart and mind to find out. So basically, he really observes to find out, to understand, not simply just to simply be aware. So mindfulness doesn't have that intention, doesn't have that loving, wanting to understand, to find out. Mindfulness, the instruction is to simply be aware first of your thought, and to be aware of what is happening, what is in the field of awareness. But here he really wants to understand, to find out. For it is really a kind of inquiry that he is engaged in. For he wants and loves to understand whatever phenomena he is observing. He says it's not a concentration, but it is a concentrated attention. For instance, he talks about fear. When there is an awareness of fear, observe it so intimately that the very observation of it is the freeing of it, which is action. He calls that action, this kind of observation that is total. And when he talks about mutation, I'll give you another quote from his notebook. The pure act of seeing the fact, whatever the fact be, brings its own understanding. From this, mutation takes place. You see, he talks about this, how to observe. However, he does not give his audience how to do it, how to get there, how to be able to observe without mind, without the mind of history, without memory. He just says that's what you need to do. I imagine he is translating his experience, because that's what happens to him, into his talks. After discussing the need for passion and love in this observation, he says, and the mind that can pursue, that can penetrate without motive, without purpose, into its own immeasurable depths, that has no barrier, that is free to wander without time and space. Then I give some quotes from his own experience, what happens when he is engaged in this kind of intense observation. Out of this vast silence, suddenly, as one sat up in bed, when thought was quiet and far away, when there wasn't even a whisper of a feeling, there came that which was now the solid, inexhaustible being. It was solid, without weight, without measure. It was there, and besides it, there existed nothing. It was there without another. It's not possible to be one with it. It is not possible to be one with a swiftly flowing river. You can never be one with that which has no form, no measure, no quality. It is. That is all. Interesting thing here, he talks about the truth that he experiences. This is in his notebook. He doesn't mention his teaching in his talk, actually. But this is one of his experiences. He talks about this solidity, a truth that is solid, that is an inexhaustible being, which reminds us of Nisargadatta, who talks also about solidity, solid truth, solid presence. But that's not what I'm going to be focusing on. I will focus more, that will take us to the other thread of his experiences, which I will discuss next lecture. Here, what is important about this quote is that it is not about non-dual experiencing. For in non-duality, one is one with the truth experience to be. And one experience is one that here he talks about truth that arises. He doesn't say, I am that. One can't say, well, maybe he is non-dual, because he's saying you cannot say one is not one with it because he is it. But if you really keep reading, you will see that he never says, I am this solidity, immensity, or other things he calls it. He never says he is that truth in all of his writing and talks. And also, he doesn't use the word I. He always refers to himself as he or K. If you read Commentaries on Living, which is 3 volumes, he talks about he walks, he listens, he pays attention, this and that. But he never says I. He doesn't use the word I. So there is he, and there's the experience, and there is sometimes what he calls the brain. So I'm saying, I'm bringing this to show that some people might think he's talking about non-dual experiencing. Actually, he isn't. And I will show that more clearly as we go on. Because dual experience, you feel you and what you're experiencing are not separate. And you and what you're experiencing are all both awareness or pure consciousness. He never says he is consciousness or pure awareness. He just talks about awareness, the intensive awareness. He doesn't say, I am awareness, which Nisargadatta talked about all the time. And it is also not dualistic, as we will see later. It's neither dual nor non-dual, which is interesting. Some people take him to be non-dual. Some people don't think about it with a dual and non-dual. But I found it an interesting thing, the way he teaches. The following quote shows his experience of this practice, which is obviously not an easy place for most people to find in themselves, this kind of occurrence of way of observation. And it is clear it is a practice all the time during living. For him, it is not a sitting practice. It's something when he's walking and he's eating, he is in this kind of mode of observation. This is from the commentaries on living. One's mind was aware of the stately trees. The rocky, you see, one's mind was aware of the stately trees. He doesn't say I as mind or one's mind. There is one, and that one's mind is aware of the stately trees, the rocky hills, the villagers, the wide blue skies, but it was also in meditation. Now he says what meditation is to him. Not a thought was disturbing it. There was no flutter of memory, no effort to hold or to resist, nor was there anything in the future to be gained. The mind was taking everything in. It was quicker than the eye and didn't keep what it perceived. The happening passed through it as the breeze passes among the branches of a tree. One hears the observation behind the conversation behind one, and saw the bullock cart and the approaching lorry, yet the mind was completely still, and the environment within that stillness was the impulse of a new beginning, new birth. But the new beginning would never be old. It would never know yesterday and tomorrow. The mind was not experiencing the new. It was itself the new. It had no continuity and no death. It was new, not made new. The fire was not from the embers of yesterday. So that's the kind of experience that happens to him. And he calls that a state of meditation. There's the observation and there's meditation. The observation, the intense observing without mind. Meditation is when there's no thought at all. There's just the awareness of what is. He says meditation, he cannot make it happen, it simply happens. I think this is one reason that none of his followers we know of has had this kind of experience, or what he calls a mutation. He acknowledges this at some point, which I will discuss in the second lecture. And he talks about the observation, and then in the observation, he talks about for the observation to be really complete, to be really one, to be with no mind, with no memory, there has to be an observation without an observer. So he frequently talks about the observation without an observer that continued to the observer is the observed. This idea of the observer and the observed, he had it, he talked about it, he did it in his dialogue. Like one of them, I remember a video, several videos of him dialoguing with David Bohm, the physicist, quantum physicist. Well, they were talking about, Kay was talking about observation without observer is the observed. And David Bohm was talking with him about it. And it seemed like they met, they understood each other about what the observer observed. And it was interesting for me to watch that and to listen to that dialogue, because my sense of it is that they did not understand each other. They talked past each other. You see, David Bohm is a physicist, and he actually loved Krishnamurti. He went to many of his talks. He did several. He learned a lot from him about the conditioning, the conditioned self, and all of that. But when he talked about the observed, and they believed they met each other, Bohm was talking about quantum theory, where the observation make the observed happening. When you make the observation, the measurement, when the measurement brings out the measured. Like when the measurement, you don't know what is there until you make the measurement. When you make the measurement, something happened. The measurement will show you whether there's an electron or not, or where. So the measurement and the measured are inseparable. But that's quantum theory. That's something about matter, and it is a theory, and it is not really an experience. Krishnamurti was talking about experience, observed, not observed. So there was a parallel in some sense, but it's not the same thing. And in fact, they have nothing to do with each other. But they believed they were talking about the same thing, which I thought was sort of interesting. Actually, it's a phenomena I've seen happening frequently when a spiritual authority or a spiritual figure or a teacher talks with a scientist. Sometimes they're talking, it seems like they understand each other, and they know what each other talking about, and that there's a meeting. What I see is that there's a meeting in the sense they're both interested. They both have the same energy of interest and curiosity, like David Bohm and Krishnamurti were both explorer, were both investigators, and they met that way. They both loved and enjoyed exploration, but they didn't meet in him what their understanding is. And I see that happening between teacher and scientists frequently. They think they understand each other when they really don't. I've seen it happen several times. The understanding is they talk about different levels, about things. There might be some parallel, but it is not, even the parallel doesn't really work. And so, of course, people, the audience who doesn't know both science and spirituality, they think it's great, it's wonderful, exciting. And I've seen that in audiences. And I was sitting there saying, puzzled. I said, why are all those people so excited about this? They didn't really understand each other. But that's what happens frequently. I don't mean that there's an understanding, but frequently that kind of experience happens, that kind of situation happens. Here I will give more quotes about what happens in his own experience in the state of total observation. In this total seeing, which is the quality of the mind, there's no seer, no observer, no experiencer. There's only seeing. That's a notebook. So that's when you see that this observation, this awareness has no experiencer, no observer. It's just the observation. It is like witnessing without a witness. which is known in many other teaching. Witnessing can be without a witness. But here he's talking about observation. He's bringing this as an important thing. And he goes on with this. For instance, answering a question about the observer is the observed, he writes, this is from The Open Door by Mary Lutyens. If you look at it as an observer looking in, then again the problem arises. But the fact is that loneliness, it's talking about loneliness is you. So you have to look at it without the observer as a whole. When you do that completely, loneliness disappears totally, never to come back. So he's saying when the observation is observing loneliness, the loneliness and the observation are the same thing. They're all the same consciousness. So the loneliness is you who is observing. Otherwise, if there's an observer that separates the observer from the observed, and for him that doesn't do it. That's not what he's talking about, because for him the observer is also part of the thought, part of the mind. That's why the observation has to be free from the observer. However, his experience, understand observation without an observer, which what it means, the observed, has more subtleties. Another quote, quite unexpectedly, all this extravagant beauty, color of the hills, this rich earth, this intense valley, all this was within one. That is one way he experienced it. It's all in him. Does that mean he is in a non-dual experiencing? Well, maybe. One is the vast, because non-dual, you got the vastness, everything in you. He never said he's the vastness and everything in him, but sometimes he said everything was in him, because, and that's sort of close to non-dual actually, but to stay with the same track about the observer, which is his main thing he talks about all the time in his talks, and because his main teaching really, which he doesn't call it a practice, and his followers try to practice it. They don't know how to practice it because he never says how to do it. He just says that's how it happens. Takes we see here another step. He is his experience. He's observing nature. He says, and strangely, you were the doves, the squirrel that raced up the tree, and the unwashed dairy chauffeur, and the river that went by so quietly. I mean, he was all of these things. So you will think that is non-dual, but that's not really non-dual. Non-dual, you are an awareness or a consciousness that is everything. He is not saying that. He said he is the dove. He's specifically the dove. He is the squirrel. He is the chauffeur. He's talking about particular thing, and that when the observation happening totally, he is one with that. So he's not talking about the whole of reality. He's talking about particular observation of things are occurring in his awareness. He goes on, another quote. You were there in that garden, but you were that thing flying effortless against that massive cloud. It was not in thought. You were up there, nor an empty fancy and imagination. You were actually up there, not identifying yourself with it, but you were that bird. That is again the observed, but he is the bird now. So he is specifically that particular bird, which is a different kind of unity than what happens in non-dual experiencing. Actually, this kind of experience happened to him around the time of his awakening at the beginning of the 20th century. And here he's talking much later in 1960 or 70. And the quote here from there at that time, I had the first, most extraordinary experience. There was a man mending the road. That man was myself. The pickaxe he held was myself. The very stone which he was breaking up was a part of me. The tender blade of grass was my very being, and the tree beside the man was myself. That is from the years of awakening. So that is him being what he observes, he being what the observation is. And you will see that when he said, I am that, I am what I'm observing, he is not saying there is an I that is being that. He is that, he is the bird without there being Krishnamurti being the bird. The bird is just him, basically. But this can get subtler because here, let me read this quote. Because he doesn't mention that his experiences get subtler sometimes. Some are subtler than others, or deeper, or more profound. In this quote, they were you, and you were they. Distance and time had ceased. The woman and the chauffeur were you, and you were they. This comes close to what Zen calls suchness, the suchness of thing, which is you are like the flower without you being somebody who is the flower. The flower is the self, the way that Zen will put it. In this case, he is the woman and the chauffeur. So that's an important thing to see, that where his experience goes sometimes, which is the practice of observation without observer, or the observer being the observed can be. The observer being the observed, here the observed is in this case the woman and the chauffeur. But the observed is no more just observed. He is that is observed. Which is an interesting kind of experience, which makes me wonder, like, for when you listen to this quote, what does it mean to you? You see? When people listen to him talking about these things, what did they understand that to mean? Did they get it? He will say it's simple, it's straightforward, it's logical, but for most people, it isn't. And that's why many people have a question about it. He was sort of controversial. What's he teaching? What is? And most people thought it's sort of mysterious, and most people, of course, thought, "Oh, it's mysterious because that's spiritual teaching is mysterious," which is true. But he talked about it. He kept talking about it, and people listened and were fascinated. And I think he was an important figure in the 20th century. The way I see it, he was a transitional figure in the sense he brought in a big scale, the idea of direct realization or spiritual realization or freedom, which is an Eastern teaching. But he brought it in, and people maybe didn't get the experience, but many people learned from that. Learn that observation is important, paying attention is important, being aware is important. And then from there, maybe many people went on to different teaching, different teachers, and it started the spiritual life for many people. I see that is his main impact, that he brought in really a force there that transformed people's life to move on to value inner experience and not just the everyday business of life. But he goes on, think it's subtler until observe is not the observed. Here we saw him, I got to the point where he is the bird, he is the woman without somebody being the bird. He is the bird, he becomes the bird totally. Which I understand. I have those kind of experiences, and that's why I can talk about them. It makes sense to me. The next one. And as you wash them in the rippling waters, you were lost. You did not see them. They were there, only you were not there. They existed, nothing else, not even space and time. There was no thought, no feeling, no experiencing. That's from his notebook again. Here, he is not being the rippling waters and all of that. He wasn't that. There was just the rippling waters and existed on its own. There's no observation, no observer, and no oneness with the observed. So here there's no seeing, no observing, no experiencing. So this is very different from the Indian teaching, I am that, or I am a pure awareness that is everything. He's not talking about that. He's talking about something very different. The point that I don't want anyone to miss is that there is only that, the rippling water or anything else, without one being that. So there's a slightly different from necessarily the Zen suchness. Zen suchness said the rippling water is what one is. Here is the true self. Here, for him, there is no true self, no self. There is just rippling water. There's no observation, no observer, no experience, no one being anything. And he is also referring to particular, not in the totality of the universe. More quotes about the same kind of occurrence. The few feet of road between us disappeared. He was observing a woman while he was walking. The few feet of road between us disappeared, and with it also disappeared the two entities. There was only that woman walking in her impenetrable sadness. She was the only human being that existed on that road. She was, and the other was not. The other is him. You call himself the other or he. The other was not. The woman was. And he is not saying he's experiencing her. There's just the occurrence. The woman was, is on the road. And again, similar quote from his notebook. There was only sound and nothing else. No thought, no feeling. So here there is just the fact without him being there as a witness or awareness or being the fact. He is not one with anything. There's simply the thing, the fact, or whatever it is, which is usually a particular in Krishnamurti's experience. And here, another quote about there's only the fact. Then there's only the fact and not the experiencing of the fact. With it came a movement of entering into unfathomable depths of intensity, and of great bliss, and there was that otherness. It is important to recognize the word otherness he brings in. This is the other thread of his experience, which I will elaborate on next time. He's referring to what he calls the sacredness or the benediction or the immensity, the solidity and the beauty and all of that. So there's the fact, and then when he is in that state of the fact, there's something else that can happen for him, which is the arising, what he called the otherness. Which means the otherness is not him. And it is not simply the fact. And he does not see it as the nature of everything, which is a non-dual realization. So I will discuss the experience of the otherness in the second lecture more fully. He does not mention this in his teaching, but his biography, his own writing, is full of such experiences. And in that talk, I will discuss what he called the process, which is the intense pain he was having most of his life, and what I understand it to be and caused by. He never understood it. And we'll discuss the question of authority and tradition and the whole thing. I know many people use the Krishnamurti now to justify that each one needs just themselves. You don't need a teacher. You don't need a guru. Everybody has their own path. Many people taking that as a new religion. But if Krishnamurti listened to those people, he would have said, no, that's not it. Not doing, because he didn't just say there's no path. He meant this discipline, intense, passionate attention to what is happening in experience now without mind, without past. He didn't say everybody got their own way. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say, and we'll open now for questions and discussions.
Define non-dual, because non-dual consciousness, because you were saying that was not what Krishnamurti was. And so then I said that the way that I think of it myself or experience it myself is that, for example, black, white, staying, leaving, opposites are the same. They are not different. They are one.
Yeah, I mean, non-duality has different meaning. Non-dual meaning you're not separate from what you're experiencing. What you're experiencing are not separate. That's one meaning of non-duality. But the most teaching of non-duality, when they say non-dual experience, they mean everything is awareness, everything is consciousness, not separate from the consciousness. And one is the awareness, is the consciousness, and everything is an expression of oneself. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. So it's more of the subject object kind of.
Yeah, I mean, he says no subject object, but for him it's not no subject object. There's no subject at all.
Right.
There's just the object, and he calls it the fact. You see, in non-dual teaching, the subject is the awareness, and the awareness is experienced palpably as a radiant, luminous field of awareness.
The way that I experience it is that it's like a wholeness, and so there is no subject. But yeah, okay.
Well,
So
I mean,
like
non-dual experience can experience as wholeness. That there's the whole thing, everything. But the whole thing is unified through some kind of a medium, through some kind of a field.
So he's talking about unmediated experience.
Yeah, he is talking about unmediated experience.
Yeah, great, love it.
Okay,
thank
good.
you. Love this
I hope it's helpful so far.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
For most of his teaching, Krishnamurti talked about choiceless awareness. Towards the end of his life, he dropped the choiceless adjective. But did he mean the same thing by this term as the Diamond approach means by pure awareness? And while we're on the subject, how about the Buddhist term that gets translated as simple awareness? I think it's mostly Dzogchen. And
Yeah, you see, in Diamond approach or in the Buddhist non-dual teaching, they talk about awareness. The awareness, aware of itself as awareness, as a empty transparency or transparent clarity. So the awareness is what one is. Here, and when he talking about choice, awareness means you don't choose. There's no one there to choose the awareness. To choose, there's just awareness of the fact. So the awareness of the fact, but he never says what awareness is. So in all his talks and all his dialogue and all his writing, I never read him describing awareness, what awareness is.
You're right. I've actually was studying him fairly intensively before I discovered the Diamond approach, and it was very frustrating. That's why I just love the Diamond approach. It's very specific.
Yeah, he doesn't really get into what is the nature of awareness. He just say there's no thought, there's silence, there's stillness, things like that. But he never really speaks about awareness or the nature of awareness, which is more the realm of non-dual experiencing, which he wasn't into it. He didn't read spiritual books, so he didn't know that other people spoke about these things.
Thank you, Hamid.
You're welcome.
The second question was about Krishnamurti does not like questions that start with how, because how solicits in answers that are in steps on a time trajectory and therefore not on a pathless journey. You need more? Or do you
I can say a little more on it if needs be, but is that clear enough? Or
it's clear enough to me. Yeah, he does. Of course, he doesn't like how, because he doesn't say how. He says there is no how. That is one important tenet of his teaching, his perspective, and there's no how, there's no way to get to the truth. Remember, there's no path means there's no how, there's no practice. So for him, the experience of pure observation simply happens. You don't go try to make it happen. That's what I understand him to mean, no how. Doesn't like it, no how, because how means a way.
Yeah, well, how is actually means that it is soliciting for a question, soliciting for an answer that's in steps, which takes you on a time trajectory. Therefore, not only it's not on a pathway journey, but the truth cannot be got on a path.
Yeah.
That's his point. And
that's his point. The point cannot be, how means there's a path.
There's a path. So you don't subscribe to the idea of pathless journey.
Well, I think there are ways. There are paths like that has path. There's no way. It reminds me of the Dzogchen teaching, which is a non-dual teaching Buddhism has. Yeah. It started in one of the ancient book, the Kunji Japa, which says the same thing. There's no way to get to the truth. There is no practice, no path. Any practice, any path will just delays the occurrence. But then, Dzogchen ended up developing all kinds of practices and teachings and many lineages of how to experience the truth, because that original teaching simply didn't work, regardless of how true it is. It is true that you practice, you do all kind of practices. That doesn't mean they cause the realization. People think it caused the realization. Realization simply happened. Just like in Zen, for instance. They say, it's not like you're sitting meditation and then, because you're sitting and something happens. No, most of their realization, what they call satori, happens. You're walking around, you hear something, a bird, and there you get hit with the satori, with the awakening. So it is not cause. It happens suddenly, but in Zen, they still sit, they still practice. And for years, and then something happens like that. He says, no, don't sit, don't practice. It will just happen.
Yeah, is it not possible that perhaps practice is the wrong word, because practice involves doing, whereas getting to the truth is an act of being something, not even becoming. Becoming means coming into being. So it's going into a state of being that's completely different, which is more transformative. And in fact, according to him, it is transmutation, and even the word mutation that he uses. So
Yeah.
it's not just a question of changing a form to a reform, to a transform, because when we go into transform, you're just changing the form. And changing the form is not good enough if the substance is not good enough. And therefore mutation is necessary. So he's talking about transmutation there as well. So
he
going
called
to
it.
going to the truth, you're quite right, requires a spontaneous leap to get into it. Therefore, it's not on a path.
Yeah, he called it mutation. And in fact, he said we need a change. That everybody need to have this change as possible. And if you recognize this change as possible, there's an intensity, there is a strong interest in the change. He called it change, while in fact it's not a change. It is a quantum jump. It is leaving one. It's a the way I look at it. If it is a change, it's a change of identity. You go from one realm to another. So it's not like you change to something else. That's what. Although he called it a change, you see. So the word change, in some sense, is not as accurate as what he calls it, mutation. That's my perspective, my understanding of it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
You're welcome, Sadhu.
Hello, thank you for having my question. I wrote it down once, so I do it from my head. I really love Krishnamurti because of his power, his urgency, and the way he transmits and hits me always. And I was wondering if you could say something about this in combination with the fading of desire and wanting, because everything is as it is, and at the same time is his true, like, he can get really upset when there's not enough people, are not enough listening enough, or he doesn't get response in the crowd. And I don't know if you have anything to say about those two things within us.
Well, yeah, I mean, he sometimes he sounds very clear. Of course, he has a lot of charisma, a lot of intensity when he talked, and that's what people liked about him. There's a magnetic thing about the charisma, the intensity, the passion. He has a lot of passion, and he says you need a lot of passion. And he said you really want to find out. But want to find out is a kind of desire. And then he says, no desire, right? But it's implicit in what he's saying that there is desire. So it's not, he sounds clear, but it is, when you think about it, it's not completely clear, because he said, you want to find out, but then he said, you have to be free from desire.
And I understand completely. I love that about it.
But to be, so basically the way I understand it is that it is possible for there to be a passionate love of the truth, love of reality, that allows a certain kind of investigation or attention where that can bring about a new truth, transformation, without you feeling desire meaning you want to change it. Here you don't want to change it. It's not a regular desire because it is more of a love to find out. The love, the passion to find out. Sometimes he says want, but I think he meant he loved to know.
Yeah.
And there is an intensity in that, and that is probably for him, that's how he experienced it. And he transmitted that intensity. And the interesting thing is that many of his students simply didn't know how to get to that intensity, how to be in that condition, which we will discuss later in the next talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very nice. Yeah.
My question was, because I'm a scientist, I was very interested in when you were talking about the scientists discussing with spiritual teachers.
Yeah.
And wait, now I'm nervous, like I'm breathing. So I was wondering, it seemed to me that you were saying that matter and spirit work in different ways. And because the scientists and the spiritual teachers couldn't understand each other. And I wanted to know, my question was, what do you think about that? Because my sense is that everything is made of the same substance or no substance, depending on how you see it.
The same what? The same
substance.
Oh, the same substance, yes.
So, I mean, I think that when you were saying that an observer doing an experiment changes the outcome of the experiment.
Right.
Because you can only see when, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think it's similar to when you inquire into an experience and when you inquire, it kind of reveals something different than what you thought. And so I thought, in my sense, is that it works in the same way and everything is the same, but I don't know what you would say about it.
Well, I mean, in the spiritual experience, that's what's called non-dual experience. You realize everything is the same, everything of the same substance. But scientists don't believe that. Most scientists, that's not their experience. That's not their observation. That's not their view. In fact, that is the spiritual people point of view. So, like I remember, one of the first book that came out called The Tao of Physics by Ridhwan Foundation, when he talks about science and spirituality that really talk about the same thing, he took the scientific point of view that everything is interconnected.
Yeah.
Which in science, yes, everything is interconnected because all the laws of physics are interconnected, all the forces work together, and that all makes the world happen. And he takes that to say that is the same unity as the spiritual people talk about. No, spiritual people are not talking about interconnectedness. They're talking about an actual substance, an actual medium that fills everywhere. It's not things are connected to each other. Everything is the same thing. Mm-hmm. Which is a whole different thing. So I thought that book missed the whole point. He mixed up two things. So he was wrong with that from that place.
Yes.
He was equated two things. They were not two. There were two things. The scientists will disagreed with him. They said, no, we're not saying everything is one thing. That will remove all the forces of physics. Everything is the same thing.
Yes.
There are electrons, there are protons, they interact, and they're two separate things for a scientist.
Yes. Well, I'm a scientist and I can see both sides, and for me it's the same, and I wish other scientists would see the same.
Yeah, I'm sure there are some scientists who, like
Not
you,
many,
have a mystical experience, mystical understanding. But scientists thought mysticism is not true, not logical, and not. But some scientists are spiritually inclined, and then they have that perspective. Like Schrödinger, for instance, one of the father of quantum physics, he was interested in some of the Vedic teaching of India. I don't know if he really understood it, but he liked things about it that he thought might help, might be similar to quantum theory. But yes, some scientists are have a mystical side, mystical experience, but most scientists are not.
Yes.
Most scientists are materialists. For them, materialists mean everything is separate. A rock is different from the wall, and a proton is different from an electron. They're really separate, you know.
Yeah. I wish it wasn't like this.
They're interconnected. They are interact, but to say they are the same substance, that's a whole other thing.
Yes. Yes. I've been in science more than 20 years, and I've spoken with maybe 2 people about the fact that I'm interested in a spiritual journey. It's just something I can't talk about with anyone.
It's great to have both sides, but I think because each one of them is valid in their own field, you know, it brings truth in their own field, but we don't need to mix them and make them the same, you know. They study things differently. I had dialogue with scientists when I finally questioned them. For instance, they were talking about consciousness. I collected scientists who each one had a theory of consciousness. I asked them, what is consciousness? So each one told me their definition of consciousness. And then I told them, what you're talking about is not consciousness according to spiritual people. This is the function of consciousness. What consciousness does, like perceiving, knowing. But spiritual people are into what is consciousness, what is the nature of consciousness. And they all said, oh, science doesn't study that. That's ontology. That's not the realm of science. And they all agreed on that. So I said, okay, so let's just not mix up things then.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Well, good talking to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Could you say something about the potential consequences for students of Krishnamurti, given that he didn't like questions that begin with how, and given that he didn't describe, he didn't offer spiritual practices, and didn't describe how to meditate and that sort of thing? What might the consequences be for his students?
Well, he actually, in the end of his life, he brought the question himself in his talk with his friends, not with his audience, with his friend. He said, nobody gets it. He said, he's talking about change. He said, nobody changed. And he was wondering, how come? So he acknowledged at the end that his way of talking and teaching didn't work. And I will discuss that in detail next time. That's one of the topics we will discuss. It's a very interesting question, actually. But he acknowledged it, and it's not my saying it, but he acknowledged that what he was teaching is something nobody actually got to experience. So the fact that there was no how translated and no learning direct. I mean, his student, we learned a lot about mind and conditioning and all of that. All the things is very important and useful, which led people to pursue their spiritual interests. But to actually, for his listener, to actually experience what he's talking about from what he said and his friend and his biographer said, nobody actually managed to get that, which is an important observation, which was good to try to understand, which I will explore next time. Hopefully there'll be enough time, there are many things to explore next time. So, but we explored today basically his main way of looking at things, which is the practice of observation without observer, which is the closest thing to a practice, really. But he never gave a how to do it. He just said, that's what happens, what the mode of experiencing, and what kind of experiences and realization can happen from that. And I gave you different level of subtleties of what it means, observation without an observer, or the observer of the observed. See, I gave you this one, how you are the, whatever you're feeling is you, whatever you experience is you, you're not somebody observing it, you are the fear, you are the whatever. And then the next thing is that you are the bird, and the one after it, there's simply the bird. Many people got to learn to, move on to their spiritual and interest, because he activated that in many people, and thousands of people. And because of that, he was a pivotal figure in the 20th century, I think. And I always appreciated him. And now I know exactly what is the true service that he provided.
Thanks, Hamid.
There were really a lot of wonderful, juicy questions in the forum, and we couldn't get to all of them, but we do have a blog, and we would highly, highly invite you to come to the blog and post your questions there, because the team and Hamid will look into them and answer as much as possible.